blinding flash of white light lit up the sky over Gaza tonight. People running for cover, not knowing whether they're dead or alive. They came with their tanks and their planes, with ravaging fiery flames, and nothing remains, just a voice rising up in the smoky haze. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in Gaza tonight. Women and children alike, murdered and massacred night after night, while the so-called leaders of countries afar debated on who's wrong or right. But their powerless words were in vain, and the bombs fell down like acid rain. But through the tears and the blood and the pain, you could still hear that voice through the smoky haze. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in Gaza tonight. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in the night without a fight. We will not go down in Gaza tonight. A blinding flash of white light lit up the sky over Gaza tonight. People running for cover, not knowing whether they're dead or alive. They came with their tanks and their planes, with ravaging fiery flames, and nothing remains, just a voice rising up in the smoky haze. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in Gaza tonight. Women and children alike, murdered and massacred night after night, while the so-called leaders of countries afar debated on who's wrong or right. But their powerless words were in vain, and the bombs fell down like acid rain. But through the tears and the blood and the pain, you could still hear that voice through the smoky haze. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We our spirit will never die. We will not go down in the night without a fight. We will not go down.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. And we'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand one day. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we'll work hand in hand one day. And we'll break down the prison walls. We will tear down those prison walls. Together we will tear down the prison walls on that day. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we will tear down all those prison walls on that day. And the truth will set us free. The truth will set us free. Truth will set us all free on that day. And deep in my heart, I do believe that the truth will set us all free on that day. And we shall day.
A blinding flash of white light lit up the sky over Gaza tonight. People running for cover. Blinding flash of white light lit up the sky over Gaza tonight. People running for cover, not knowing whether they're dead or alive. They came with their tanks and their planes, with ravaging fiery flames, and nothing remains. Just a voice rising up in the smoky haze. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in Gaza tonight. Women and children alike, murdered and massacred night after night, while the so-called leaders rulers of countries afar debated on who's wrong or right. But their powerless words were in vain, and the bombs fell down like acid rain. But through the tears and the blood and the pain, you could still hear that voice through the smoky haze. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in Gaza tonight. We will not go down in the night without a fight. You can burn up our mosques and our homes and our schools, but our spirit will never die. We will not go down in the night without a fight. We will not go down in Gaza tonight. A blinding flash of white light.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. And we'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand one day. Deep in my heart, I do believe that we'll work hand in hand one day. And we'll break down the prison walls. We will tear down those prison walls. Together we will tear down the prison walls on that day. and the truth will set us free. The truth will set us free. Truth will set us all free on that day. And deep in my heart, I do believe that the truth will set us all free on that day. And we shall overcome on that day.
Okay, wonderful. Hello, everybody, and welcome to CIGA's second international conference on Palestine, challenging apartheid in Palestine, reclaiming the narrative, formulating a vision. Today is the sixth and final day of this conference, and we are about to commence on session number 11. Today is Wednesday, June 23rd. Welcome, everyone. Today, I will be introducing the session chair, Ms. Zinat Adam, Afro-Middle East Center, South Africa. A brief about Ms. Zinat. She is an international relations strategist, an entrepreneur, and a political opinion writer. She served as a senior diplomat in the South African Foreign Service, focusing on the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. She led election observers mission to Palestine, Madagascar, and South Sudan. Ms. Zinat, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Yasmin, and thank you to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs for hosting this. We have already had such a wonderful conference over the last few days in which most of the panelists who have spoken have examined the various aspects of the Palestinian issue. And we've heard from analytical minds from around the world who've mapped out the geopolitics of the struggle against the Zionist apartheid settler colonialist state. In this penultimate session of the conference, we will be looking at the requirements and criteria for dismantling apartheid. In addressing this question, our panel of experts will be delving into understanding the global solidarity movement, building of political alliances, boycott, divestment and sanctions, popular resistance, and the role of youth. Our objective in this discussion is to identify the levers of power that we need to target, to challenge the current global status quo that supports a political apartheid that is deeply entrenched systematic mechanism that has been built over decades with the aim of subjugating and suppressing indigenous Palestinians. While we recognize generations of Palestinians have been subjected to sanctions, sieges, the ongoing Nakba, mass imprisonment, most notably ethnic cleansing and genocide, we also admire the resilience, the tenacity, and the unfailing heroic spirit of resistance. The recent acts of intimidation and brutality meted out in Sheikh Jarrah, in Al-Quds, in besieged Gaza, have ignited a popular resistance that has spread globally. And it is through that inspiration that we have from Palestinians themselves that the global solidarity movement has really been uplifted. I think this has been one of the strongest responses that we've had in the global solidarity movement, but we have a lot more work to do in order to dismantle the apartheid system. And what we also need to be looking at in the discussion today is how we have utilized some of the technology that has been available in our hands, using Twitter, using TikTok, using Facebook, to get the message across and to break those previous notions of what the struggle is for Palestinian freedom. The other thing that I want our panelists to also look at is how are those surveillance mechanisms in Google, in Twitter, in TikTok also being used against the Palestinian struggle. So to start off, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Nerdine Kiswani. She is going to be talking to us on the role of the youth and university campuses. And I think this is so critical because after a very long time, we're seeing young people really express themselves very strongly in solidarity with the Palestinian people. Nerdine has been part of the liberation struggle against the Zionist forces, and she's been mobilizing on campuses throughout the US and in looking at dismantling the Zionist institutions. We're really looking forward to listening to what Nerdine has to say. And since we're limited in time in terms of our introductions to each of our speakers, I will leave that as that. So Nerdine, over to you.
Thank you, Zinat, for your introduction, and thank you all for the other speakers for being here and for the conference organizers for inviting me and creating this space where this important discussion will happen. I'm really excited to hear from everybody else. For my portion, I'll just focus on exploring the strategies of student organizing for Palestine on campus, what has been effective that I've seen and where we can build. I've been involved in student organizing and different venues throughout the years, from my time as president of Students for Justice in Palestine, during undergrad at the College of Staten Island, and vice president of SJP at Hunter, to now being on student government, and also currently president of Students for Justice in Palestine at CUNY Law. So I've almost been in the CUNY system for 10 years now. It's the largest public Black and brown working class university system in the country, and right here in the belly of the beast in New York City. So I've been able to gauge a lot of the gains that we've made for Palestine organizing over the years. I've witnessed and contributed to these gains that I've seen the struggle for Palestinian liberation against Zionist forces on campus has made. And while my talk today will highlight some of the ways students like myself continue to face repression and harassment for Palestine organizing, I also want to show how the tide is turning in our favor. And this is because we know that the student movement can provide revolutionary leadership if it's integrated among broader progressive struggles to build power for oppressed people.
I couldn't even find her.
Really, globalizing the struggle for Palestine. Palestine organizing also doesn't exist in abstract discussions. It's rooted in concrete political goals of the collapse of U.S. imperialism that sustains, Israeli colonization of Palestine and so much oppression all over the world, and also the dismantlement of Zionist institutions. And these principles have kept us strong against being watered down and stripped from anti-colonial roots. And it's also made our movement, expand. It's helped our movement find commonality with other struggles. And it also helps us learn about other struggles through analyzing our own. By drawing from the strengths of SJPs on different campuses, at the time when I was an undergrad, we began to develop an understanding that the Palestine movement cannot be confined to a campus struggle as student organizers at the time. And it never was, but this is how our political awakening occurred, just understanding that if we were committed to the liberation and justice for the Palestinian people, we have to recognize that, there are Palestinian communities in New York City and all over the US. And, four-wall auditorium panel discussions, as robust and necessary as they are, aren't always the most accessible spaces. And we also understand that, students are not an autonomous social force, nor should our political interests be independent of the interests of the broader oppressed communities and people. So out of this, we've created a Palestinian-led community-based organizations that was originally made up of the different SJP chapters among CUNY at the time. Now it's called Within Our Lifetime, United for Palestine. Formerly, we were called NYC SJP. And we've been leading protests across the city for a while now, especially during this latest uprising. And, this has set off another litany of attacks that has occurred since being invited to this conference, and today. And because this work has been more of a threat to Zionists than even my organizing on campus. They constantly reference it. My law school has even confirmed to me that Zionists have reached out recently, in just the past week, asking for my school to punish me or even discipline me for my outside activism. And they really look at what we're doing out in New York City, even like saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free at a protest, as proof of anti-Semitism. Like there's a picture of me with a flyer or a sign that says that. I'm not even holding it, not that I wouldn't be proud to, that's what I chant all the time, but someone's holding it in the background and they put a red around it and put it on this popular page called Jewish Lives Matter. And within moments, I received countless death threats, DMs, comments all over social media. And, they're always tagging my university, trying to push this anti-Semitic narrative, mostly to academic institutions, believing that they're the ones who are able to punish us and who, could potentially wreak the most havoc or do the most damage, on my life. It's not like there's other, like sure, the harassment, everything comes in, but they do have a goal of getting students who do this work to be vilified, to be seen as anti-Semitic, and to be, constantly under the microscope and feel threatened that, every time they say or do something for Palestine, even outside of the university, this can come back and be used against them, or, just have these campaigns against them to to really manipulate reality and, create these like false campaigns that are probably, a lot of these people, while some of them I'm sure are real Zionists that are happy to harass me, I think a lot of them are also bots. And a lot of it is social manipulation to create the idea or the feeling that there is anti-Semitism, right? And always putting that with Palestine, Palestinians, Palestinian activists to create this idea that they're synonymous when really, anti-Zionism is one of the best forms of actually fighting anti-Semitism. And it is Zionism itself that is one of the most anti-Semitic, things that we see. So, ever since being outspoken about organizing for Palestine, just like this incident, these campaigns happen every once in a while for me, every few months. I've received countless death threats, Islamophobic, racist, misogynistic slurs hurled at me, and of course, accusations of supporting terrorism and being anti-Semitic. And, before this, it actually culminated into a well-funded app with deep ties to the Israeli government, creating a mission or a campaign against me. And this was even covered by the New York Times in an article where they, define act ill or reference act ill. And this is in quotes, saying that it, in quotes, assigns users missions to combat anti-Semitism, including a pre-written note to be sent to Ms. Kiswani's deans. The app was developed by former Israeli intelligence officers and partly financed by the casino billionaire Sheldon Adelson, who died this month, end quote. So, these things aren't like disconnected from the Israeli government, from the broader Zionist Hasbara propaganda machine, and all the money and effects really tied together. They're not even hiding this. And I was all too familiar with it having experienced this before as a student organizer throughout my life. And, this brings us to the compliance of targeting Palestinian students in academic institutions. Because, not once did our university really stand up for us in a meaningful way. Of course, they can't expel, punish, or discipline me or any other student in any way for our freedom of speech rights to speaking about Palestine. Of course, they know that these accusations of anti-Semitism are unfounded, but they also see us getting attacked and see how the university is used to attack us and create this hostile space for us. And oftentimes they don't even speak out. I'm still in the process of pressuring my university along with other student organizers. I'm the vice president of student government even, so we have broad support from students, from faculty, but there's still some administrative pushback. I'm pushing them to publicly acknowledge and apologize for their role in not defending and protecting Palestinian students in the face of these attacks. But like I said, we're all too familiar with it. Even going back to 2016, just from the Zionist Organization of America, which obviously isn't hiding any political affiliations, writing to the chancellor at the time of CUNY and its board of trustees, accusing SJP of anti-Semitism and demanding the suspension of SJP chapters across CUNY immediately. CUNY launched this task force investigation on anti-Semitism where they interviewed me, professors, so many students, SJPs across the university. Now, even at one point for Hunter, they suspended our club activities without notice, which, we had lawyers represent us in that because it was unconstitutional of them to do so. And this investigation lasted up until most of us graduated. And once we graduated, they came out and said, of course, these students are not anti-Semitic. Saying free Palestine or from the river to the sea or even long live the Intifada, while some people may not like it, it's not anti-Semitic. This still suspended and crippled our work for a long time because instead of us fighting for Palestine, now we're fighting accusations of anti-Semitism. Now we're being investigated. Now we're meeting with lawyers. Now we're, being questioned and we have to, not have time for meetings, figuring out an event for Palestine, but we're meeting because we have to meet with a lawyer and then we have to meet to be investigated by the university. The Anti-Defamation League, which is a right-wing organization masking as a anti-hate group, even praised CUNY leadership for the move. At the same time as this is all going on, there was ongoing surveillance issues at CUNY. We had NYPD actually infiltrate MSAs, Muslim Students Associations. And we knew that, SJP was also being surveilled. Palestinians, Muslims, people who supported Palestine were being surveilled. And we never heard CUNY to this day make any apology, any acknowledgement of something so drastic. But as soon as, a Zionist organization and, to even take it higher than this, Andrew Cuomo, who's still the governor of New York, in March 2016, he actually voted, he led the charge, and the New York State Senate voted to slash $485 million in funding to senior colleges in CUNY to send a message that they have not done enough to fight anti-Semitism on campus. And the allegations of anti-Semitism, of course, came from the ZOA letter to CUNY. So not only, is the ZOA in itself problematic, but the letter and all the accusation they did was just them conflating Judaism with Zionism, of course, an ideology that uprooted Palestinians with an ethno-religious, group. And we became a tool in between state and city bureaucracy to be scapegoated as a pretense not to fund CUNY. Of course, they didn't go through with this, but it just goes to show the lengths of how much even, the city, the state, the administration collaborate to punish Palestinian students and to make it seem like, they're taking a strong hand in fighting against anti-Semitism. But we know that, campuses are uniquely targeted because national liberation movements and supporters have always used colleges and universities to mobilize and conduct popular education, and to mobilize for mass movements, especially because CUNY is the largest Black and Brown university system in the country and had a very revolutionary history. And so when we organize, we aren't putting Palestine in a bubble as if it's somehow distinct and separate from other anti-colonial struggles that have been struggled for around the world. And those of us fighting for Palestine come from a long legacy of organizers fighting not just for the freedom of Palestinians, but the freedom of people living under colonial domination and anti-indigenous white supremacist structures around the world and here. People with institutions like university have brought the struggles of Puerto Rico, South Africa, Vietnam, El Salvador, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so many other countries front and center. And, as students in the US, and especially as students in New York City in the CUNY system, we come from a long tradition of connecting the fight against imperialism and colonialism to the fight of Black and Indigenous liberation efforts in the US. And just like Zionist organizations try as hard as they can to stop our struggle on and off campus, powerful forces have attempted to use the same tactics of defamation, administrative harassment, expulsion, and censorship to weaken and repress the liberation movement of others. So, of course, we expect this. We've used this as an opportunity to make Palestine even more well known. Every time we are attacked, they say, all publicity is good publicity. It just gives us more of an opportunity to talk about Palestine. We've defeated campaigns and efforts to push IRA, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates Judaism with Zionism. And we actually won this on a CUNY-wide level. And, throughout these attacks, there have been countless statements from almost every single student organization at CUNY Law, from the Faculty of Color Caucus, from the general CUNY Law and CUNY-wide community, showing support not only for me and Palestinians who organize and people who organize for Palestine, but also for the entire Palestinian national liberation struggle. So we really look at these Zionist attacks as an opportunity to further promote our cause, our struggle, and to build solidarity with other oppressed people, with other movements fighting for liberation. So yeah, I'll just end there. Thank you all for having me today. And I look forward to hearing from everybody else.
Thank you so much, Nerdine. I think that you've touched on such important issues about how to mobilize on campus and the kind of intimidation that is taking place. But very crucial to me is fighting against the greater white supremacy and the colonial struggles that are still very critical in this day and age. When we look at Kashmir, for example, we look at the Rohingya, we look at other parts of the world where people are fighting for basic human dignity. So I really thank you for raising that and for bringing it to the fore, because I think it's important to connect the struggles. And by doing that, we also get people to have some empathy for the Palestinian struggle. Our next speaker is Miko Peled. He is a writer and human rights activist who was raised in Jerusalem. Driven by his family tragedy to explore Palestine, he's written a book about his journey called The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Miko has been very active in the BDS movement as well, and he will be talking to us today about the BDS and popular resistance. Miko, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you, Dr. Sami and CIGA, for holding this important conference and for allowing me to be part of it. It's a real pleasure and an honor. Before I start, I want to read something that I just received yesterday from a friend in Gaza. Two very, very short stories that I think are important to read here. So this is the first one. It's called A Short Story About the War. While we were fleeing our home at night because of the bombing, I found my friend laying on the ground covered in blood. Body parts were all over the place. Every time I remember this, I cry. I may cry now. This year, Ramadan was so beautiful, as I was able to fast most of the days. But when the attack started, everything changed. It was the longest month ever. I called my friend Ragad. She is my friend and neighbor. She used to be always talkative, but during the attack, she was so terrified and only said, "Will we ever have a chance to celebrate Eid and wear our new clothes?" I said, "No, there will be no Eid these days because the war began and we might all die and go to heaven." After a while, they were bombing everywhere. Our house was shaking. I started shouting, "Mama, Mama." She was in the kitchen, and as the bombing was getting stronger, I fell onto the ground. My father carried me, and we all ran to the streets. Do you know what I saw then? I saw my friend, Ragad, dead, covered in blood, and all people were running for shelter in the UNRWA schools. It's a good thing that I don't have flowers. Do you know why? Because flowers get scared too, just like us, and they die of it. It's good that I haven't planted flowers to die from fear. I would be responsible for their death. It's true that flowers smell good, and their smell could cover the smell of the bombs. But it's unfair to the flowers to die like us. 11 days passed, and I haven't been able to laugh, even for once. I don't know. I was most of the time either crying or silent, trying to understand what happened and is still happening to us. When they declared that there was going to be a ceasefire, I was sitting down and waiting for everything to finish and for the calm to start. When they started the prayers at the mosques, I felt extremely happy, and I asked my mother if we could prepare a cake for our family. And we did. I was excited to go to sleep so that I could wear the clothes for Eid the next day. I woke up and wore my new clothes for Eid. My uncles came and gave me gifts. Eid was so beautiful. Don't think that I'm running away from the topic. No. I know that Ragad wasn't there celebrating Eid with me, and she couldn't wear her clothes for Eid. But she's in heaven. She's in a better place. This was written by Ghazal Sharif, 12 years old. The other one is even shorter. This is by a young lady that I know, a young mother in Gaza, and she sent me this story. Dima Said, who was 7 months pregnant, and her 5-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter, Zayd and Maryam, were directly targeted. They were at home with their father, Muhammad. Dima and the 2 children died immediately when the house was attacked. They were targeted with 4 airstrikes, which burned the entire apartment. Muhammad has been in a coma for 33 days. He was severely injured and doesn't know yet that he lost his pregnant wife and 2 children. Before the attack, Zayd and Maryam were waiting for Eid to start. They were very excited that they asked their father for gifts. They decided exactly what they wanted. Zayd asked for a tractor, and he asked his father to decorate it and put it in a box and give it to him on the first day of Eid. Maryam asked for a beautiful doll with makeup. Muhammad asked his wife to go and buy these gifts, and she did. She prepared everything for the Eid celebration. She prepared cake for the night of the attack. While looking through the rubble of the destroyed house, the cake was found in the oven, still waiting to be baked. Maryam's body wasn't found until 10 days later after the attack. And the reason I thought I would start with these stories is because there's a reason why we do this, and I think sometimes we forget. And it's important not to forget. I was just in Palestine. I got back about 10 days ago. So I was there throughout May during the attacks and during what was really an uprising, an incredible uprising. Just before I left, a good friend of mine, some of you may know him, Iyad Burnat, who's from Bilain, one of the people who initiated the popular resistance movement, and I've known for years. His 2 sons, who are now 18 and 20 years old, were picked up or kidnapped by a gang of Zionist terrorists. And they've been, for the last few weeks, held in the Mascubia, which is the interrogation center and prison which is right in the center of West Jerusalem, right by all the nightclubs and restaurants. And him and his wife have not heard from them. They just know that they're being held there, which means they're being tortured regularly. Now, I remember those two boys years. I remember them growing up because I would go there very often to participate in the marches and the protests. And I remember when they were too young to participate. Now they have been kidnapped, arrested, and they're being tortured. So this is a whole new generation that is going through this. And it seems, having returned from Palestine, my strongest impression was that the patience has become our enemy. Patience is no longer an ally. And as I'm sure everybody, certainly on the panel, but probably in the audience as well, know that in 2005, Palestinian civil society had given us a gift. They had given a gift to all of us, mostly those of us who are on the outside, which is a very precise call to action, a very precise roadmap. What we can do, what all of us can do to further the cause of the liberation of Palestine. And when we say liberation of Palestine, it sounds a little bit, academic, kind of theoretical, which is why I started with these stories. Iyad Bornat's sons, Muhammad and Abdul Khalik, are in prison as we speak, being tortured. These two stories of death and destruction of families and children are not unique. In fact, the young lady, the mother who sent them to me, has so many stories that she doesn't really know where to start, and the sense of guilt of having survived and having her daughter still alive. We're talking about a massive tragedy that I think just the depth of this tragedy, the horror of this tragedy, sometimes I think escapes us when we talk about the liberation of Palestine, when we talk about human and civil rights. So this kind of just brings it back down to reality, to real earth. I heard this quote this morning on the radio. It's attributed to Mother Jones, to Mary Harris Jones, where she said, "Pray for the dead, but fight like hell for the living." And I feel that quite often we do pray and commemorate the dead, but even with all of our efforts, we're not fighting like hell for the living. We tend to wake up, and again, this is, having come right back from Palestine, we tend to wake up and to protest and to demand and to fight and to give lectures after the attacks. And then there's a tendency to go back to routine. Not everybody, of course, not all of us. But it seems that is the tendency around the world. And the problem is we need to be fighting for those who are alive right now so that they remain alive. Because as everybody listening here, I'm sure realizes, there's nobody to protect Palestinian children. Palestinian children in the prison of Gaza have no one to protect them. The Sixth Fleet is not going to come and save them. They could, but they don't. The Sixth Fleet could declare a no-fly zone over Gaza, but they don't. Children in Naqab, 250,000 Palestinians live in the Naqab. Citizens of Israel have no access to water or health care. Their homes are being ruined. Thousands of homes every year of these Palestinian citizens of Israel being demolished. There's nobody to protect them. They become homeless. People in Sheikh Jarrah, people all over Jerusalem. Sheikh Jarrah is now, of course, in the headlines, and of course I visited there. I've been going there for years because this issue of Sheikh Jarrah has been going on for years. But it's only one part of an entire effort of the ethnic cleansing, or what they call the Judaizing or developing of Jerusalem, which means destroying remnants of Palestine, destroying the history of Palestine, and Islamizing Jerusalem. There's a reason why we saw these vicious attacks in Al-Aqsa during Ramadan. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why the only way non-Muslims can get onto Al-Aqsa is with the tours that are run by the settlers, by the very people who want to destroy Al-Aqsa. And I actually went on a tour like that while I was there. It's horrifying. So when Palestinians gave us this gift, which is the call for boycott, divestment, and action, there was a reason, and sanctions, there was a reason why we needed to respond quickly. And the sense of urgency is something that I feel is somehow lacking. The call for boycott, divestment, and action and sanctions came with very clear, particular, reasonable demands. Things that that internationally have already been sanctioned. Ending the military occupation of parts of Palestine that are still run by the military. I don't call it the West Bank anymore because there's no more West Bank. It's all a part of the state of Israel, the apartheid state of Israel, and there are these large pockets of population, Palestinian population, which Israel defines as difficult populations. And they are part of Judea and Samaria. There's no separation between the West Bank and the rest of the country unless you want to go into one of these pockets of Palestinian population. So those areas, the military occupation still exists, and that, of course, needs to end. The right of return. It is, the UN Resolution 194. It has been voted on and voted on and voted on and reaffirmed, I believe, more than any UN resolution in the history of the United Nations. And equal rights. So these are three of the most probably reasonable, measured, and sensible demands any national liberation movement could possibly demand. Yet here we are it's been more than 10 years since the call for BDS came out. And people are still arguing it's anti-Semitic, it's not anti-Semitic, it's the right thing to do, it's not the right thing to do. What are we waiting for? For more? How many more Palestinian children need to suffer? How many more Palestinians need to end up in jail? How many more Palestinians need to be tortured before there's the wake up, there's a sense of urgency? Again, I go back to my trip. Having returned, the sense is that I left behind an injured human being that is bleeding to death very rapidly. And while it used to be kind of cool and, felt good to wear the t-shirts with Free Palestine and wear the kufiya and to say, express solidarity is no longer enough. What we heard, the excellent speaker just before me, Nardine, the activism on campuses is absolutely inspiring, absolutely fantastic. What they go through and still persevere and still continue is incredible. We need to follow that example. And when I say we, I literally mean every single person with a conscience. Every single person with a conscience needs to oppose Zionism with everything they've got. Every single person with a conscience needs to oppose and stand up to Israel with everything they've got. And the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions gives us the tools, the demands. The three demands touch precisely on the three major issues that ail Palestine, that ail Palestinians as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel and the Zionist occupation of Palestine. Since the apartheid regime has been imposed on Palestine 74 years ago, these are the three issues that we deal with. There's no equality. The privilege that I have as an Israeli citizen, you can't compare that in any part of the country. There's no part of the country where Palestinians enjoy the same privileges I do. Not in Jerusalem, not in Jaffa, not in Haifa, not in Naqab, certainly not in Gaza or anywhere else. Even Palestinians on the outside don't enjoy the same privileges. They can't even visit, as I'm sure you know. So there is no equality. The brutality of the Israeli military, we saw it in Al-Aqsa. We see it now in Jerusalem every day, whether it's the old city, whether it's Damascus Gate, whether it's Sheikh Jarrah, whether it's Silwan. Silwan has kind of been pushed a little bit to the back, to the back burner. The violence that the people of Silwan, of this beautiful community, this beautiful kind of, town, it's really a town, it's not so much a neighborhood, it's very big, adjacent to the old city, is horrifying. Just to walk down the street of Silwan, it's, down the hill there, you feel the tension in the air. Why do Palestinians need to live without the privilege that Israelis across the street have? And why are we not fighting for that? So the equal rights, the brutality of the military occupation, and why do Palestinian refugees still need to remain in camps? Why do millions of refugees still need to languish in camps after all these years? Even though, obviously, the world stands behind them, in terms of, at least the way it's expressed in the United Nations resolutions. And I think we've just come to a sense that we should compromise. Many people think we should compromise with Israel, we should compromise with Zionism. After all, there was the Holocaust and so on and so forth, and anti-Semitism is a problem, and, the Jews have suffered. If we follow that logic, then every country has to open its jails and release every Jewish prisoner, because that means Jews get a pass. Because Jewish people suffered, they get a pass. They shouldn't be arrested. They shouldn't be held accountable for any crimes that they commit. Now, certainly not all Jewish people are Zionists, but the Zionists do like to pretend, or at least present themselves as the saviors and the representatives of the Jewish people, which of course is not true. But why do they get a pass? Why does anybody even remotely think it's okay to compromise on the freedom of Palestinians, on the lives of Palestinians, on the rights of Palestinians? We need to embrace the call for BDS and run with it. We need to demand it of our elected officials. We need to demand it of our governments. It's not enough to express solidarity with Palestinians. It's not enough to call out Israel for its crimes. It's not enough. There has to be a absolute zero tolerance to Zionism. Zero tolerance. There should be no diplomatic missions of the State of Israel. There should be no diplomatic missions in Tel Aviv. We need to take this up, not one notch, but 100 notches. It's been more than 10 years since this gift was given to us by Palestinian civil society, and we still have not even begun to do what is needed. So yes, tremendous work is being done on campuses. Progress is being made even in the United States politically. Small. Too late for the 200 or so Palestinians who were just murdered in Gaza, and God knows how many since have been murdered in Jerusalem and in other parts of Palestine. And regardless of the murders, the slaughter, a Palestinian child in the Gaza Strip with a curable cancer will die. An Israeli child living a mile away, 1.5 kilometers away, 2 kilometers away with the same disease will live, because Israel decides who gets access to medical care. And it's not true only actually for Gaza, it's true for Palestinian children at all, everywhere in throughout Palestine. Now, talking about popular resistance, I think what we saw during the month of May, the uprising that we saw everywhere, in Nasra, in Haifa, in Jaffa, in Akka, in every Palestinian city, in the Nakab, in Jerusalem, the sense of unity. A whole new generation. These are young activists. I was in court. I spent a day in court in Bersaba, in the Nakab, with Palestinian activists there. Over 3,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel were arrested during this uprising. Many of them were arrested after they were beaten by Israeli mobs. They were bringing the worst kind of extremist Israelis. And you don't need to go far, because most Israelis, they try to characterize the protests and the death marches, or the marches calling for death of Palestinians, as some kind of an extreme variation. These are regular Israelis. They don't represent anything extreme. This is how Israeli society talks about Arabs. So calling to death the Arabs is not extreme when you talk about Israeli society, but they were exporting the most extreme of those into Palestinian towns where Palestinian citizens of Israel live, in order to create provocation, in order to beat people up. Horrifying things. And of course, the Israeli police does not intervene, only to arrest the Palestinians who were victimized, who were beaten up, who dared to stand up. So we saw an eruption of Palestinian popular resistance, real popular resistance, gone beyond the boundaries that the State of Israel created. West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, 1948, these are all artificial boundaries that really have no bearing whatsoever on the lives of Palestinians and on Palestine. These are artificially created and exist in the minds of Israelis and people who support Zionism. So the question always comes up, so what do we do? We need to be part of the resistance. We can't be in solidarity anymore. Now, how do we participate in the resistance? Well, everybody has to choose. Like I said, Palestinians gave us a gift, which is an option to participate in the resistance, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Every government official, every elected official, whether they are part of a school board, city council, or national government, need to know that there can be no tolerance. There needs to be zero tolerance to Zionism. That if they express the smallest support to Zionism, there will be a demand that they are relieved of their duties. And certainly we're going to be called, and we are called, I think everybody here on the panel has probably been called anti-Semitic already. But we're not the ones dropping bombs on children. We're not the ones denying children water. We're not the ones who are allowing children to die. We're not the ones who are detaining and torturing young Palestinians whose only crime was that they stand up. And the other sense that I get when I return from Palestine, one is that I'm leaving behind a bleeding friend. But the other one is that there's nobody protecting them. All these brave, intelligent, dedicated young activists, thousands of them, nobody protects them. Any single Palestinian activist can be shot tomorrow by the police, by the army, by the secret police, by the Shabak, by a settler, just by anybody, a passerby, and there will be no consequences. Nobody is there to protect Palestinians. It's all up to us. All up to us. And when we see the next attack on Gaza, when we see the next Palestinian being beaten in Jerusalem, when we see the next Palestinian family, and I was sitting with Palestinian friends of mine who live in Sheikh Jarrah, who have until the 1st of August to leave the home in which they lived their entire lives, the homes in which they were brought up. People who are older than I am. When they are thrown out of their homes, it will be our failure to stand up. All of these things represent our failure to stand. And it's not that we don't do what we can. We do a lot. We need to do more. I'm, like I said earlier, I'm inspired by student activism. CUNY is a great example, by the way. I had an experience there as well. But, colleges throughout the world, actually, not only in the United States. I'm inspired by the activism of Palestinians. What goes on in the Naqab, which is the entire southern half of Palestine that is rarely discussed, what is happening in Jerusalem. The activism, the bravery, the courage, the intelligence, the brilliance of young Palestinians who are just, entering college, some of them. as they come out of jail, as they come out bruised and beaten by the Israeli secret police. So that should be our inspiration, I believe. And again, the pathway is there. The gift is there, waiting for us to grab it and run with it. And it's not just about buying or not buying an avocado or dates that were raised by Israel. It's demanding that no Israeli representation be allowed in sporting events, cultural events, academic events, political gatherings, diplomatic gatherings. We need to be there to make sure that they know they are not welcome. Just the way it was done, and I remember this with South Africa. You couldn't invite a South African team to participate in a sporting event. You would be penalized as an organization. Same for universities and so on. The host would be penalized for inviting them, as they should have been. And the same should be done with Zionism. The same should be done for Israel. And I would warn that we stay away from their arguments, from their narrative. They want to talk about anti-Semitism. They want to conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. They want to confuse everything. Let them confuse it. That is not our conversation. Our conversation is to save Palestinian lives, save Palestine, save Jerusalem, save Al-Aqsa. That's our mission. That's our conversation. So again, I want to thank Dr. Sami for organizing and CIGA for organizing this incredible conference. This is incredibly important, and I would beg everybody to go home and do everything we can so that next year, if we meet, we'll be celebrating the liberation of Jerusalem, the liberation of Al-Aqsa, the liberation of Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miko. I think that one of the things that you have been so firm on is that solidarity is no longer enough and that we have to have the global resistance. And I think these are the most important messages that you've left us with. But I really, really appreciate how beautifully you introduced the stories that made it so heartwarming and reminded us why we do what we do and why we're having this conference at the end of the day. And what we want to achieve, as your last words were, is that we want to have that liberation and be celebrating that, inshallah, very soon. Our next speaker is Professor Berdal Aral. He is a professor of politics at Istanbul Medeniyet University. He is an expert on international law and human rights, and he is an author of 3 books, Self-Defense in International Law, Collective Rights as Third-Generation Human Rights, and From Global Security to Global Hegemony, UN Security System and the Muslim World. Over to you, Professor Berdal. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Zeynep. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. And I have to mention that, I have written another book, final book in 2019. It's published on the Palestinian problem, international law in Turkish. So, I've been engaged in the Palestinian problem from an international legal perspective. I think this conference is really a great opportunity for really understanding the nature of the Palestinian problem and the ways in which to combat against the domination, the hegemony of the Zionist discourse in the world, and the problems as well as solutions to the Palestinian problem are being discussed, and I'm very delighted for that. And I also thank the previous speakers for their, impassioned, really, and a very lively speech about the problems that they tend to encounter while defending the cause of the Palestinians. And Miko has really graphically illustrated the drama, the tragedy of the Palestinians. And I admire the way in which he presented his views and his passion for the Palestinian rights. I think we have to appreciate that. My speech is about, the title of my speech is Building Political Alliances. I would like to begin by saying that building political alliances with the Palestinian cause is not only about finding allies who are aware of the Palestinian problem. Of course, for the Palestinian cause, we need to have allies that are aware of the Palestinian problem, the deep-seated problem, and the obstacles that they face, and the human rights violations committed against them, as well as international legal violations. It also is important that the allies, political allies, should be engaged in activities to advance the cause of the Palestinian victims against the Zionist occupation. Of course, these are very important. But apart from these two conditions, I think we need to focus on two other dimensions of alliance, political alliance with the Palestinians. And one of them is that it's important that the allies are aware of the common threats that run through the Palestinian suffering and their own suffering, oppression. Because the oppression, of course, the Palestinian oppression is a very deep-seated one. It's horrific, no doubt about that. However, many of those who espouse the cause of the Palestinians, they also have their own grievances about the international system. For instance, they may have possibly a very significant, possibly he or she may be, a part of the colonial, legacy in the country in which he or she lives. I mean, because non-Western world were actually colonized by, the same hegemonic powers that actually also, support Israel. Colonization, military occupation, racism, oppression, suppression, social exclusion, marginalization, for instance, indigenous peoples in different parts of the world, African peoples, Asian peoples being, victimized by colonialism and the devious, consequence of the colonial practice. And of course, we could also draw on the unequal international system, the hegemonic system that dominates the world today, the way in which capitalism and imperialism, they try to establish, white supremacist system in the world. So I think it's important that the political allies should also understand, become aware of the common grievances that they suffer. This will increase the engagement, the commitment of the political allies, of course. And of course, apart from that, finally, we could also talk about the purpose of the struggle should be to alienate and punish the oppressor, that is the Zionist state. It's not about trying to simply convince the Zionist state to negotiate with the Palestinians and make some minor sacrifices, so that the whole problem is being thrown out, put under the carpet. It's not the case. Of course, the struggle should involve also alienating the Zionist state and to punish the oppressor. This is part of the entire struggle, actually. Palestinian problem is actually the mother of all injustice in the world. I mean, if an individual does not identify with the Palestinian problem, I think that person has to question whether his or her humanism has died. It's something that's very instinctual, actually. I mean, the degree of injustice committed against the Palestinian people, the depth of the tragedy and the length of the tragedy, the extent of oppression, the extent of human rights violations, crimes against humanity, war crimes, the denial of the history, the culture of the Palestinians. I think it's so huge that the deviousness of the oppressor is so clear that there's no way in which one can, legitimately or humanely argue the case for Israel. So any sensible person with some conscience is expected to actually support the Palestinian cause. So in a way, political alliance with Palestinians is something that something that we can expect that comes, as part of human nature in a way. In a way, we could say that every individual is potentially an ally of the Palestinian cause. Of course, the important thing is to be able to convey the message and to establish, common threads that bind Palestinians and those that support the Palestinian cause. As I said, it's the mother of all injustice. And we should not forget also that the Palestinian problem is not just the problem of the Palestinians, but the Israeli aggression is also directed against, the neighboring Arab states. It's also directed against, all those who, support the emancipation of the non-Western world, emancipation of the Muslim world, confronting the American aggression in the Middle East and the Muslim world, because we know that Israel is actually one of the main culprits of the U.S. interventions. It is also, it has always engaged in, dirty relations with some of the most egregious, some of the most authoritarian and human rights violating regions like South Africa during the Cold War, for instance. So anyone could actually really identify with the Palestinian cause. When we talk about allies, establishing allies, I think we are talking about a group of individuals or non-state actors, civil society institutions that come together as a team to accomplish a particular objective. However, we should not forget that alliance does not always establish among those who are, willing to establish a better world. You could also have actually, alliance can be established for devious purposes as well. For instance, during the Cold War, Israel and the United States had close contacts with the South African system, apartheid regime. All the colonial states in the past, they actually had strong alliance among themselves during the colonization of the non-Western world, Africa, Asia, South America, North America. Ethnic cleansing, forceful assimilation, massacring people, denying their culture. They were almost always in solidarity, except for some exceptional situations. The same could be said for instance, today. The right-wing anti-immigration parties, they have established political alliances in Europe against migrants, against minorities, against, people with different religions and culture. So alliance is not necessarily something done for a moral purpose. It can be done for other devious purposes. So we have to say then that establishing alliance in the context of Palestinians, in this case, is not only about morals. Of course, the moral, we want the moral side to be very powerful. Of course, supporting the Palestinian cause is a moral one. There's no doubt about that. However, morality alone cannot really demolish the forces of oppression. There has to be something beyond that. There has to be a long-pronged struggle against dominant forces that produce this inequality and hegemony in the world system. So in this context, the alliance building with the Palestinians depends, at least in my opinion, on three factors for its success. One of them, of course, is that the political alliance should be aware of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians in all its forms. So it's not only about human rights violations. It's not only about imprisoning Palestinians, but it's also colonialism, establishing a settler colonial state, the apartheid wall, war crimes, the crimes against humanity, turning Gaza into an open prison, illegal settlements, denying the most basic rights to the Palestinians, and many other aspects as well. So it's important that the political alliance should become aware of this dimension. Secondly, they have to pose challenge. So those who are allies of the Palestinians, they have to pose challenge to these repressive policies. It's not just about reconciliation, trying to convince the Israelis to behave more correctly, but it's a matter for posing a challenge to those repression policies. And finally, to preempt the possibility of Israel appearing as a normal state, as any other. Unfortunately, we are living in an age when, some of the Arab states have come to recognize Israel as a normal state. They have normal relations, although Israeli oppression, colonization, and human rights violations have actually become even more pronounced. In spite of that, many Arab countries many Arab states have established normalization. But I think we have to be aware that Israel is not possibly a normal state because of its, the monstrous violation of Palestinian rights, colonialism, war crimes, aggression, state terrorism, but also the fact that it doesn't even have borders. It's a state that has no borders. So we should be aware that Israel is not a normal state, and the project of establishing political alliance against Zionist occupation has to involve, of course, should include an understanding that Israel is not a normal state and should not become a normal state, as in the case of South Africa during the Cold War, for instance. South Africa, the apartheid system, was not permitted to become a normal regime, normal state. And as you well know, of course, the long-pronged struggle by the people themselves, of course, the most non-white people in South Africa, and international solidarity movements, together with the United Nations General Assembly, because General Assembly in the 1960s, especially in the 1970s, adopted a series of resolutions, not only condemning the apartheid system, but also suggesting sanctions against this racist state. It also was, complemented with resolutions boycotting all sorts of economic, social, and cultural, educational ties, sport and sports ties with the apartheid state. And then in 1977, the Security Council of the United Nations, which has the authority to take binding decisions, was convinced eventually, or rather was forced, in this case, especially the United States and the British, which had been very cordial towards the apartheid regime for many, many years, but their resistance ended in 1977 when the Security Council imposed, mandatory military sanctions against South Africa. So I think this is very important. This sort of strategy is very significant in the context of the Palestinians. This is a long struggle, actually, and involving many different actors, many different processes, many different frontiers of resistance against the Zionist states. United Nations was also instrumental in the context of, anti-colonial struggles, for instance. When many Asian African nations became independent in the 1950s, 50s, and 60s, United Nations General Assembly resolutions, as well as, of course, International Court of Justice advisory opinions, were very instrumental in enhancing the cause of the colonized peoples, and gradually became independent. Of course, I have to say this was accompanied by many sacrifices. I mean, colonial states do not easily abrogate their powers, but at least the United Nations context, facilitate the process of independence based on self-determination. The same can be said for Namibia as well, which was under South African military occupation, and these racist entities, South Africa, and as well as its domination there, were, eventually brought into a normal state of affairs through the United Nations actions in different platforms. So I think the political alliance with the Palestinians should also involve the United Nations platform. So we have to be able to use the United Nations very effectively. You could say, today United Nations Security Council is not going to probably adopt any binding decision involving sanctions against the Zionist state, and you are right, of course. But there's at least one alternative, and that's the United Nations General Assembly. A Uniting for Peace resolution can be an avenue of, adopting a set of resolutions against Israel, because in 1950, Security Council suggested that in case that the United Nations Security Council has faced deadlock because of veto by a permanent member, then the General Assembly is authorized by 2/3 majority to advise all sorts of sanctions against a state or any other action, including the use of force, by the way. For instance, allies of the United States in 1950 sent their troops to South Korea against North Korean invasion based on the United Nations General Assembly resolutions. So therefore, I think we have to think about these mechanisms as well. And the idea of solidarity is a very important part of course, establishing political alliance with the Palestinians. This is also, in a way, a defiance, the other people supporting the Palestinians and sacrificing themselves for the cause together with the Palestinians is something that is resistant in itself, because, the capitalist ideology is suggesting that individuals are, selfish beings. They only live for themselves. They don't care about others' interests, others, benefits, but that's not true. Actually, this political alliance is an indication that one is not free until all are free. The Africans, the Asians, they have lots of reasons to be on the side of the Palestinians, as I said, because of their common experience. This also, of course, extends to the indigenous peoples in the Americas, Canada, Australia, and other parts of the world. And many indigenous peoples, for instance, in the United States, we know, as well as the black activists, they have been very supportive of the Palestinian cause because they have managed to find the common threads that bind them to the Palestinian problem. Police brutality, in the case of the indigenous peoples, the dislocation from the traditional territories, discrimination, marginalization. These causes actually have brought together these different peoples on the side of the Palestinians. We see this pattern also in different parts of the world. The same, of course, applies to many different Muslim peoples, Afghans, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and all other Muslim peoples, because the Muslim world also has suffered in the 20th century of lots of military aggression, occupation, or support for the authoritarian regime in the Muslim world, mainly by the United States and its European allies in most cases, as well as the Western lack of interest and even opposition to the Arab revolution in the last 10 years. So in a way, there is this common thread that binds many different peoples in the world with the Palestinians. I think we have to appreciate that, and it always comes with a cost. For instance, to give you an example, many Black Africans, if they are, for instance, professionals, if they are engaged in supporting the Palestinian cause, they are active, they could actually lose their job professionally. They risk losing their jobs. If they are part of they are part of an association. The association could be deprived of funds. They could be ostracized. They could be harassed. So there are lots of social and cultural and economic action and political costs engaged in this struggle. So we have to be aware of that. Political alliance is always something that one has to sacrifice. One has to accept the possibility of certain problems that have not been thought of. I'm finishing off by saying that there is growing interest in the cause of the Palestinians, and I think, as Miko has finally recounted, it is now time for action. It's not enough to just condemn and show sympathy to the Palestinian cause, but I think we have to find ways to really to actually to reduce the space granted to the Zionist state and to face the hegemonic domination of the international system, which are interlinked in our struggle for the liberation of Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Berdal. I think that you've really contextualized the challenges that we face in forming those global alliances and in how we need to move forward. I mean, particularly when we look at the United Nations system that is defunct, and the UN system itself being one that needs reformation in order to have that kind of equality, and the polarization that we experience in the world, but also how imperialism and capitalism is impacting directly on how we're forming those global alliances and the threats that there are out there to people who find an affinity with the Palestinians, and many who are falling prey to that. Our next speaker is my colleague, Mr. Naeem Jinnah, who is our Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Center in South Africa. He is a well-known activist, an academic, and a leader in the Muslim community, and he has been in the Palestinian struggle for a number of years. Naeem will be speaking to us about forming a global solidarity movement. Naeem, over to you.
Thank you, Zinat. Thank you, Dr. Sami and the staff of CIGA for a really wonderful conference from Friday till today, bringing together really good presentations and important and critical presentations in many regards. I am the last speaker in the second last session of a 6-day conference. So I'm sure that this is a really tiring part of the program for many of us. Let me begin by talking about international solidarity. Begin with a quote from someone from my region, my part of the world, the revolutionary leader Samora Machel, who said about international solidarity that it is not an act of charity, it is an act of unity between allies fighting on different terrains toward the same objectives. Solidarity, he said, is an assertion that no people is alone, no people is isolated in the struggle for progress. Solidarity is the conscious alliance of the progressive and peace-loving revolutionary forces in the common struggle against colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. In short, against exploitation of human by human. So I want to just divide my presentation up into about 5 different points that I have and that I want to make in the time that I have available to me. My first point is that we cannot at this point in time talk about Palestinian solidarity without carefully and seriously considering the events that took place in May last month and this month. The events in Palestine and the continuing events in Palestine, which resulted in massive expressions of support for the Palestinian people, massive criticism of Israel's actions from around the world. Also, in this period, or towards the end of May and into June, we also saw huge expressions of victory from Palestinians and solidarity activists around the world, whatever that might mean. Whether this, the past 2 months marks any kind of turning point in the Palestinian struggle remains to be seen. I'm not entirely convinced that that is the case. However, what it has thrown up for us are numerous opportunities to grow a global solidarity movement. I should make the point here that the topic on forming a global solidarity movement is not an entirely appropriate topic because, and this is my second point, a global solidarity movement does exist. It exists. What is required is for it to be developed and nurtured. What is required is for it to become more coherent. It needs to be more effective. It needs to have a common vision and a common strategy, but it does exist. And there have been many gains in the past decade in particular to strengthen a global solidarity movement. Clearly, of course, we can talk about the boycotts, divestment and sanctions campaign around the world, and other speakers have spoken about this already. I'm not going to go into any great detail, but since 2005, as Miko referred to the BDS call, until now, there have been huge gains in terms of BDS across the world at various levels, perhaps not so much at the S level, but certainly at the other levels, there have been very important gains and victories that have been made. But we must also accept that while a global solidarity movement exists, its development has been uneven globally. While there has been much focus from many of us on North America and Europe and parts of the Arab world, well, at least parts of the Arab world where civil society is allowed to exist or freely exist. However, many parts of the global south have not been as active. If I want to be harsh, I would say many parts of the global south have been ignored by us. This is a huge mistake. I was invited to speak in a seminar last week organized by a group in Indonesia. And what I found out just before the seminar, and more importantly after the seminar, after doing some work around this, was that both in Indonesia and Malaysia, both countries which do not have diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, in both these countries, there has been a massive push by Zionist organizations. In Indonesia, both Zionist organizations from the US as well as Australia are working extremely hard within civil society in that country, talking about things like interfaith relations and academic cooperation, etc., in order to penetrate that society. Indonesia, of course, is the largest Muslim country in the world, largest Muslim population. Malaysia has been very strong in the non-aligned movement, very strong in ensuring that it will not have diplomatic relations with Israel, etc. But what is happening in these countries, partly because many of us in the solidarity movement have ignored work in these countries, is that there is this flipping of many people by the Zionist lobbies from outside the country. In the event that I was to speak at, there was an Israeli on the panel who is a settler from an illegal settlement near Hebron. That's the level of penetration that they have. An important development, however, I should say in this regard, was the Global South call last year against Trump's annexation plans. A declaration that was signed by a number of prominent personalities from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Not as many as we perhaps would have liked, but that was from July last year, and there's a move now to revive that global call, the Global South call, and to get more signatories to sign on to that, committing themselves to the liberation of the Palestinian people, committing themselves to struggle against Israeli occupation, colonization, and apartheid. We're also seeing at the moment the building of a new network, a BDS Africa network. Sub-Saharan Africa in particular has been targeted for the past 4 decades by Israel quite carefully, quite systematically, at the economic level, at the level of security cooperation, at the level of supporting religious organizations, particularly Christian evangelical organizations, etc., to the point that those states that we might have in the past regarded as being natural allies of the Palestinian people, we can no longer regard that as being the case. And in many cases, even those societies, we can no longer take for granted. And this is, of course, part of our problem, that we take too much for granted, particularly with regards to the Global South. If we think back to a few decades ago, the role of the Global South in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa was absolutely crucial. The non-aligned movement, the Organization of African Unity, the Southern African Development Corporation, what we called the frontline states, etc. In the Palestinian context, of course, frontline states are a joke, frankly. But in the South African case, the role of the Global South was absolutely crucial in helping to take us towards our liberation. Can that role be recreated? And how can that be recreated is an important question, and I think a question for a much longer discussion. What is the role of governments of the Global South in, and the previous speaker mentioned this as well, in structures such as the United Nations, the African Union, the non-aligned movement, etc. What is the role of these governments in, for example, ensuring the revival of the Special Committee Against Apartheid, so that Israel too can be subjected to the strictures of that committee that operated in the past against South Africa? My next point that I want to make was, or is rather, that, and this point has been adequately made, and so I'm not going to stress on it, by both Nerdine and Miko, is about the unity of struggles for justice. That there is actually one struggle for justice. We might have different manifestations of it, we might be involved in different parts of it, but there is one struggle for justice, and we have to regard justice as being indivisible. Let me come back here to the last part of that quote from Samora Machel. I quoted him at the beginning, but I left out this last 2 sentences where he says, "Solidarity has no race and no color, and it has it has no countries and no frontiers. There is no solidarity just among Africans. No exclusively Asian solidarity, since the enemy of the people also has no country or race." And this is the point, that all our struggles are one, and all our struggles have to be seen to be one, because the struggles of the other side are one. We have globalized capitalism and imperialism, and it has to be confronted by globalized resistance. We remember, of course, just a few years ago, not long ago, just a few years ago, slogans, Gaza stands with Ferguson. When I see them, I see us, etc. At the time, these were seemingly innovative slogans for many of us, and we all spoke about them. But that idea is now part of the fabric of Palestinian solidarity activism around the world. Again, Nerdine, I think, highlighted that very effectively about how it operates in the United States. But around the world, the notion of indigenous solidarity, the notion of anti-capitalist solidarity, and how the Palestinian struggle fits in to all of these other solidarities and all of these other struggles. Last month, one of the strongest statements that I heard, and I mentioned this the other day, on Sunday, I think it was, one of the strongest statements that I saw that came out in South Africa in support of the Palestinian people when the onslaught was taking place on Gaza was a statement by an organization called Abahlali Basem Jondolo, literally the shack dwellers movement. This is a movement of shack dwellers, people who live in shacks without electricity, without running water, who live daily with the threat of being attacked by rats, daily with the threat of not knowing whether they will have food the next day. And the statement was headed, Palestinian blood is our blood. And this is what globalized resistance is all about. This is what it means when we say that all our struggles are one struggle, that global struggles are local struggles and local are global, that struggles against colonialism in one part of the world are actually about struggles for land in another part of the world, or struggles for electricity in some other part of the world, or struggles against poverty in another, that the struggle for Palestine is the struggle for us all. This is what, of course, Nelson Mandela meant when he said, we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. There's another quote by Mandela that is as important, if not more important, when he referred to Palestine as the moral issue of our era. So in a sense, all our struggles are the struggle for Palestine, and the struggle for Palestine is the struggle for all of us. My next point I want to introduce with a little video. It's just 30 seconds long, just because it's the last session, and I'm sure many people are bored with my speech already by now. So let me just put on this 30-second video, if I can get it to work. Here we go. Do you see the video?
We can't see the video.
We can't see the video, Naeem, but we see you and hear the sounds.
Okay, let me try and fix that. Sorry about this. Well, for some reason this now is not working. Okay, I'm going to try once more, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Do you see it now, Zinat?
No.
No, Naeem,
Okay.
nothing yet.
Okay, now I'm going to skip it. So let me just talk about my next point. The video that I wanted to show you was a video from the 21st of May on the Durban docks, when activists and trade unionists marched in protest against the docking of the Zim Shanghai ship at the Durban harbor. The plan was for the ship not to be offloaded. It was offloaded, unfortunately. But the importance of the protest on the 21st of May it brings me to my next point. And this point is kind of a bit of a distortion of a slogan that we had in the apartheid era in South Africa. And so the slogan that I'm now recreating in new context is apartheid divides, Palestine unites. The video that I wanted to show you, the 30-second video, is of that march. And what you see in the front of that march, and this video, by the way, not that I put any store on such statistics, but this video got more than 1 million views within about 2 days after it was posted. But the video shows in the front of the march 2 huge banners. One banner, 2 huge banners side by side, one of the Congress of South African Trade Unions and the one next to it of the South African Federation of Trade Unions. The second organization was both federations of unions. The second federation was a breakaway from the first. They are therefore rival federations competing for members, competing for benefits, etc. On that day, at that march, they marched together, they held their banners together, and they ensured that both of their banners and both of their people got equal prominence in the march. Because, as they themselves said, as the worker leaders said in that protest, Palestine unites. And so while apartheid divides, Palestine unites. And so clearly Palestine unites even at a local level. And if we're talking about building a global movement, we need to understand the usefulness of Palestine in uniting even at a local level, even for local struggles. My next point is about the need for a vision. The need for a vision for both Palestinians, which I think is something that is a huge challenge, and for the solidarity movement globally. How does a solidarity movement operate when it is unsure what its end game is? And this, I think, is the truth. I'm sure that some others on the panel might want to challenge me about this, but I believe that this is the case. What are we as a global solidarity movement mobilizing for or towards, apart from short-term tactical gains? What is the end game? Remember what happened to the Palestine solidarity movement after Oslo, because there was confusion about what the end game should be. And so in many parts of the world, after Oslo, the solidarity movement became demobilized. It's not the kind of situation that we want. And that is why we need to have a clarity of the vision that we are working towards as a solidarity movement, and of course, as Palestinians as well. My next point is about the need, after talking about the need for a unified vision, a need for a unified strategy. Certainly we have BDS as a strategy, and we all, everyone on this panel has mentioned, at least mentioned BDS or spoken about BDS. We all believe that we support the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, and we believe that it is an important part of the struggle in support of the Palestinian people, an important part of the struggle in isolating the apartheid Israeli state, but it is part of a strategy. BDS in itself cannot be a whole strategy for the liberation of a people. What would a broad solidarity strategy look like? This is a question that I think many of us in the solidarity movement around the world have dodged, have not answered. And in the past 15 years, we have very conveniently tacked onto the reality that a BDS campaign exists in order to avoid answering the question about a broad solidarity strategy. The current moment that we're seeing from May into June sparked for many of us a greater respect globally for the internal Palestinian resistance, an aspect that for many people has been ignored in many parts of the global solidarity movement. After all, what was last month's victory, I'm putting that in quotes, about, if not about the Palestinian resistance? It was not about seeing pictures of dead children on the New York Times front page. It was not about the Israeli Supreme Court case against Sheikh Jarrah residents being postponed. It was not about the postponing of the March of Flags. It was about the resistance from Gaza. It was about the new and innovative and great resistance in the 48 areas. It was about the unity of different forms of resistance in 48 in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Jerusalem. Our talk of victory, if we talk about victory in May, was about resistance. And so how can we only talk about a strategy of solidarity as encompassing one part of it, just BDS, without ignoring what Palestinians see as something that is great and victorious for them? You know, we often, as an aside, perhaps a bit less in the past few years, but certainly still do come across this ridiculous and rubbish notion from Zionists and also liberals who pretend that they support the Palestinian people. That, you know, if only Palestinians were more peaceful like Nelson Mandela was, instead of sending all these rockets and all of that. Of course, this is a grave injustice to the memory of Nelson Mandela, who was sentenced to life imprisonment, not because he was a Gandhiist, but who was sentenced to life imprisonment because he was the founder and leader of Mkhonto weSizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress. Because resistance is part of any struggle. Resistance, in fact, in a sense, is victory. Solidarity, too, is victory. And so a common strategy I would propose for the solidarity movement globally would include two significant pillars: BDS, of course, and support of Palestinian resistance. The first one of these two, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, is growing, and many people throughout this conference have spoken a lot about it, so I'm not going to speak more about it. The second, the support for Palestinian resistance, and when I say support for Palestinian resistance, I don't only mean you know, doing what I'm doing now, standing up in a conference and saying that we support Palestinian resistance. I mean something much more and much deeper than that. This of how Palestinian resistance can be supported, I think, requires much more thought. And, you know, a public conference like this certainly is not the place for such thought. More than that, and Zinat, I'm going to end in the next 2 minutes. More than that, in terms of a unified strategy, there are a number of other questions that we need to ask ourselves. Some of these questions thrown up by the past month and a half. For example, how do we relate as a solidarity movement, and as Palestinians part of the solidarity movement? How do we relate to those Palestinians who have really become irrelevant in the struggle? How do we relate to Bantustan leaders? How did we relate to Bantustan leaders in South Africa? How do we relate to Bantustans and the Bantustan project? In the current case, the Zionist Bantustan project. In the previous case, the apartheid South African Bantustan project. How do we relate to those? Is our part of our strategy to placate that project and those who are part of and lead that project, or is it something else? It's a question, and I don't have an answer to it. Another question: how do we define, or perhaps redefine, following on the past month and a half, the role of Jewish allies in this new context? So let me say that in the South African context, and I should just say here that I speak a lot about the South African context, not because I believe that the South African struggle is a model for the Palestinian struggle or for any other struggle. I speak about the South African context because I'm South African, and it is what I am familiar with, and it is what I draw my own inspiration from and my own understanding of struggle and of solidarity. In the South African context, how did we relate to white allies? We had, for example, the End Conscription campaign, which was an important structure within the broad anti-apartheid movement. Young South African white men who refused to be conscripted into the army faced, and some of whom were sentenced to 6 years imprisonment for that. What was their role in the struggle, and how was their role used by Black people and Black liberation organizations in the struggle. In the South African context, the first acts of sabotage in the 1960s, when it was decided that the era of non-violent struggle was over, and that there needed to be a determined push for an armed struggle. The first acts of sabotage, among the first acts of sabotage, were those conducted by white activists, one of whom was sentenced to death as a result. The role of white allies in the underground in South Africa, in smuggling pamphlets, weapons, etc., into the country as white people who could travel in and out of the country easily. This was how white activists were viewed in the South African context. How do we view the role of Jewish allies in the new context, beyond Miko giving speeches and standing on platforms, which is extremely useful, but is there a role for Jewish activists beyond this? Our unified strategy that we must be talking about must not only be in broad and general terms, but it must also be in specific and focused in focused terms. We must look at sectoral networks globally, more than networks just among solidarity organizations, which already exist through the BDS movement and in other cases. For example, concrete academic networks that are explicitly pro-Palestinian, academic boycott organizations that link up with each other, not through their related solidarity organizations, but link up with each other. Organizations of artists, medical professionals, worker organizations, etc., students, and some of that we're seeing happening. On the legal front, networks of legal activists. And, you know, relating to this perhaps, and the last speaker mentioned this, so let me just mention it again as well. The move right now to revive the Special Committee Against Apartheid at the United Nations, that move requires the work of legal, political and diplomatic activists from around the world. And such sectoral networks need to exist outside of, not outside of, but alongside other kind of solidarity activities. And finally, in this regard, let me just point to a recent such network that is developing and growing just because it has gained lots of publicity in the past few weeks. And that is the Block the Boat campaign. In the US, in various different ports, no workers crossed the pickets in every port city that Zim Lions went to since the third week of May. In some places, the Israeli government actually intervened and attempted to coerce ports to have the ships offloaded. There's now a movement, there's a network that's developing, a Block the Boat network that includes activists in the US, in South Africa, in different European countries, and beyond, in order to ensure that Zimline ships are not offloaded, and in order to ensure that that Israeli ships are not offloaded. And so I think that the responsibilities that the past month and a half placed on us as solidarity activists is huge, but the opportunities are also huge. And so looking at redefining what a global solidarity movement needs to look like and taking on these various challenges, driven and inspired by the resistance of Palestinians themselves, I think will take us forward in this for the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naeem. We have a very short time beyond this to have some questions and answers, but just to comment a little bit on some of the issues that you've raised, I'm so pleased that you brought up the issue of the dock workers. I'm sorry that we were not able to see the video that you wanted to share with us, because this is one of the most important acts of resistance and solidarity with the Palestinians in our current time. And I think also the Abahlali, the shack dwellers, I think just drawing those parallels between what is happening in apartheid Israel, in the Palestinian context, and what we experienced as South Africans under apartheid is so imperative. One of the other things that really struck me from your conversation was the discussion on the Indonesian issue, where you were asked to be a panelist. And for me, the interception, interrogation, intimidation, and also the attraction that the Zionist movement currently has in trying to draw people to their side. We know that this is through their surveillance. We know that many of the former Unit 8-200 IDF social listeners have been implanted into organizations like Facebook, Instagram, even on Google, Microsoft, and that they utilize their positions in order to try and censor the Palestinian resistance and solidarity, but also in attracting people who are ordinarily seen to be human rights activists and drawing them into the Zionist fold. So these are really critical issues that we need to look at. But I also appreciate that you spoke about the end conscription campaign that South Africa had. And in the last few weeks, we've been seeing a lot more videos emerging of IDF soldiers expressing their dissatisfaction with the Zionist entity that it is. And perhaps this is something that we should put ourselves and our strength behind. When we talk about resistance, I think what stands in my mind most prominently are the beautiful smiles we saw on the faces of Palestinians as they were being arrested. And if there is anything that we take with us, I think that is one of the most critical aspects. So with that, we're going to go into our question and answer session. I'm going to ask our speakers when answering to please keep it as short as possible, bearing in mind that we will be moving to our next session very shortly. And so we definitely need to wrap up very quickly. I'm going to pose questions to each of the speakers, give them an opportunity to respond. And then we will come back to closing statements. So our questions to Nardine, posing that, how can we sustain the activism of students post-graduation? What do we need to do for their continuous engagement? What tactics should we have, does the SJP and similar groups have to stand up to the bullying of Zionist groups? And there is an observation that a good majority of campus activists are females. Is that true, and is there a logical reason for that? It's also noted that that there are increasing numbers of Jewish students joining the struggle. Can you comment on that? And we will then go on to questions to Miko and to the other speakers thereafter. So Nardine, over to you.
Sounds good. I'll try to address all of those as quick as possible. In terms of, and I might do it backwards, in terms of Jewish students and increased presence of Jewish people in the movement, I'm happy to say that at my law school, the Jewish Law Students Association actually voted unanimously to change their constitution last semester to be explicitly anti-Zionist. So I think they're the first Jewish anti-Zionist organization at CUNY. And consistently, whenever I'm under attack, they are the first ones to put out a statement in solidarity with me. A lot of the anti-IRA work and a lot of the Palestine solidarity work at CUNY Law has been really fueled and pushed by so many amazing Jewish students. There are a lot of women activists on campus for sure as well. I think in general, you know, maybe from our communities, we may be more prevalent in universities, or have more, you know, are more encouraged maybe to be like part of these spaces. I'm not sure why, though. I can't really comment on it too much beyond that. But in terms of sustaining activism beyond the campus, that's a very important question. And that's the exact reason why we started our organization. I was part of SJPs, like I said, on multiple campuses. And I, you know, saw the you know, every 4 years people would graduate, new people would come in, and they would have to kind of start from scratch. And the, you know, administration would always, you know, have tricks up their sleeves, and, you know, use the naivety and, you know, just lack of just being new, using that against the students, against their favor when it comes to organizing for Palestine, putting all these like stops before them. And by the time you learn the administration and you learn the university and you learn how to navigate these spaces, you're on your way to graduating. So we started within our lifetime out of the different campus SJPs existing at the time for people to kind of like graduate into that. It's open for students, community members, and just, you know, understanding that there should not really be a big distinction or any distinction between campus activism and community activism, in that like we don't favor one necessarily over the other, but they feed into each other. So campus activism helps support community organizing by, you know, funneling people into it, supporting with resources, etc. And the same with community organizing, where we are able to share our strategies, our knowledge, you know, just the institutional history that we've built up over the years with people on campus. So I think it's very important to combine the two. And then also another strategy that's been very effective in helping us combat this, beyond getting legal support from organizations like Palestine Legal, which I think is important for people to have everywhere, is building coalitions with organizations of other oppressed groups. Whenever Palestine is under the attack, the Black Law Students Association, Latin American Law Students, Asian American, you know, all the different affinity groups, and, you know, even just general political groups organizing, whether it's for internationalism, whether it's the formerly incarcerated law students, they all come out in statements in support of Palestine, in support of students who are attacked by Zionists on campus. And, you know, we do the same for them, where it also, you know, we're called upon to show that solidarity. So having these relationships being built constantly all the time, not just when one of us are under attack, and really showing it that when an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us.
Nardine, if I could ask you one more question. How is the solidarity movement within the universities and on campuses working to have that kind of correspondence and coalition broader with the Global South and universities that exist in the Global South?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure too much of, you know, how these relationships are being built, even, you know, within each other. When I first joined CUNY, all of the SJPs didn't even talk to each other from the same university system, let alone talk to other groups in the city, let alone, you know, things outside of the country. And I think that is one of our biggest challenges, because we are so much on the defense. We are facing attacks constantly. It does make it difficult to correspond with others. But I think, you know, through community organizations, this work is more prevalent. You know, that's why we think it's important to bring people from the academic sphere into the community space to actually build these kinds of correspondences and relationships. So, you know, I'll have conversations with groups in Palestine through within our lifetime, and we're bringing people in from the universities into that space, you know, and other groups around the world as well. So again, I think it's important to think like beyond the academic sphere to do that.
Thank you so much, Nardine. Miko, your questions from the audience are the following, and if you can please keep your responses as short as possible. Can you comment on the situation inside Israeli society? Is there any hope that there could be a critical mass within the Jews in Palestine to oppose Zionism, or are they all complicit in the crimes against Palestinians? Can anything be done to wake them up before it's too late? Are they all complicit? Not there at all. As someone who lives in a small town in the Midwest in the US, what can I do to support the Palestinian struggle? And a last question to Miko is, conceding that Palestinians have the right to defend themselves, how effective do you think are the Palestinian rockets hitting Israeli cities? Are there any short and long-term benefits?
Okay, I'll do it as briefly as I can, although this is enough for an entire lecture. There is hope for Israeli society, but that's only the day after. So I think, again, the power of BDS, once the state of Israel has collapsed, while Zionism has collapsed, while Israeli society realizes that the system that gives Israelis privilege over Palestinians collapses, once Israelis understand that that can no longer continue, and they cannot travel overseas. They cannot get grants to university overseas. And again, Israel is completely isolated. Then of course they will change. I mean, at the end of the day, people want to live a life and go to work and raise their children. But it's only going to happen after it collapses. It's going to happen the day after. It's not like we can rely on allies within Israeli society. I mean, of course, in the fringes, in the political fringe, there are good people who do important work to support the Palestinian struggle, or the struggle for justice in Palestine. But in terms of Israeli society, what we've seen, the expressions that we've seen, the calls for death to Arabs, and all of this is quite typical. And again, until Zionism collapses, until Israeli society has been hit hard and has no choice but to realize that they must share their privilege with Palestinians and allow the Palestinians to return, and until there is, a real democratic state with equal rights, with one person, one vote, that's when things will change. That's not going to change before that. That's why we have a struggle. That's why we need to win. That's why we need to defeat Zionism and all of its tentacles around the world and in Palestine. What can somebody in a small town in the Midwest do? A lot. I mean, organize, get and bring more people into the circle, or organize an event, organize a boycott. Go to the local supermarket, make sure they stop selling, or do whatever you can to make them understand why they should stop selling Israeli products, why there is a boycott. Sometimes these things seem small and insignificant, but that's how we bring about change. We change one person, then they talk to their friend, they talk to their network. And then find out, I always tell this to people who are, beyond college, find out if there is an SJP or some kind of Palestine solidarity group in your local college, in your local university. Go there, talk to them, see what they need, how you can support them, how you can work together. If there isn't one, encourage them to start one. So, the list goes on, and if anybody ever wants to contact me, or I'm sure Nadine could give people advice as well on what they could do within the United States. But there's a lot that can be done, absolutely a lot that can be done, and all of it counts, all of it matters. And then, look, in terms of the rockets, I flew to Tel Aviv in May, and I couldn't, my flight was canceled because no flights were landing at Tel Aviv airport. I had to go through Amman, Jordan, and cross overland. So the only major airport that Israel has was closed for over a week. That is a major blow. That is, that's very effective in terms of the goals of the resistance. So that I would say is a success. The fact that Israelis, by and large, I mean, I was sitting in Jerusalem, the rockets were falling, and it made very little change. But there is a sense that this over-security that Israeli feels was jeopardized. Another thing is, this is not directly related to the rockets, but during the assault on Gaza by the Israeli military, they did not dare. Not one Israeli soldier dared to enter the Gaza Strip, because they remember in 2014 they paid a heavy price in terms of loss of life of soldiers, and many high-ranking officers were killed as well. So they tried to portray it, they turned it around and said, yes, it was some kind of a strategic decision, but really we know that the Israeli military is afraid to bring troops into the Gaza Strip because they know they're going to pay a heavy price, and Israeli society is not willing to see that. They call it the Hezbollahization of Hamas, actually. They have a term for it, where they know that Hamas now is far more effective, and the Israeli troops don't have an answer to that. So I mean, I think that covers all three. Again, I'll just go back to the first one again, because I think it's really important. Israeli society will change the day after. Racist societies don't change until they're hit hard. So the day after, I think things will be fine. Israelis and Palestinians will live together in a liberated, democratic Palestine. And then I think they will be able to get along just fine. Most Israelis are actually descendants of Arabs, because their grandparents came from Arab countries. But until BDS is successful, until Zionism collapses, it's not going to happen. I don't believe it will.
Thank you so much, Miko. And I think that it's really poignant that one of the biggest militaries in the entire world, and certainly per capita, is afraid of a few rockets that are falling from Gaza. For Professor Berdal, the following questions are posed to you. In the past, Palestine was a consensus issue among many nations in the world, the OIC, non-aligned, Global South, etc. Now we see that many countries in the Global South, including Arab countries such as the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, Sudan, Oman, as well as major countries such as India, have now warm relations with the Zionist state. What can be done about that to bring Palestine back as the cause and symbol for the global struggle for freedom and justice? Second question to Professor Berdal. Turkey has been, at least for the past decade, very vocal in its support to the Palestinian struggle, both at the state and popular levels. Yet Turkey is by far the largest trading partner with Israel to the tune of $5 billion. How do you explain this, and what could be done about it, since Turkish officials and citizens are staunchly pro-Palestinian? Your third and final question, Professor Berdal, what do you say to people who claim to be supporters of the Palestine struggle, yet they normalize with Zionists under the justification of engaging them to influence them, which brings tension with pro-Palestinian factions? In your opinion, what are the red lines needed to keep our alliances together? Please keep your responses short.
Well, I mean, these are major questions. I mean, you could questions. So I try to be as brief as possible. First question. Now they recognize the state of Israel. I mean, lots of Arab states have come to recognize the state of Israel. I think the major way in which we can, combat this tendency towards normalizing, establishing normalization with the state of Israel is to, I think the initiative of the Islamic Cooperation Organization is very significant. I mean, Turkey takes it very serious. I mean, the Islamic Cooperation Organization can actually initiate a series of historic decisions, and one of them I suggest should be imposing wholesale sanctions against Israel. Arab League could do the same thing, but I'm not sure whether the Arab League could do that, because many of the key Arab states have come to either establish normalization or they have come to have some illicit connections, like Saudi Arabia, for instance. So I think the Islamic Cooperation Organization is very, very crucial here, because a few states among the Muslim states can initiate this process by forcing others to take historic decisions, imposing sanctions. And actually, there is a historical precedent for this. During the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the Arab members of OPEC actually initiated the boycott, petroleum boycott against those who supported Israel, like the United States, European states, Japan, and it had very, very crucial impact on the way in which the West was considering the Palestinian problem, from refugee problem to the question of self-determination. So I think one of the ways in which this can be done is through Islamic Cooperation Organization. Secondly, I assume that states like Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the non-Arab states, I think, should take initiative now. I mean, it is no longer at this stage possible, it seems, for the Arab states to take initiative. I think, for instance, the AIDS, it's an international organization among 8 prominent Arab Muslim states, including Turkey, Indonesia, and some other, Iran, Egypt, and so forth. I think they can also initiate a political process in which they could try to isolate Israel. And I think the third stage, the third thing is to establish particular economic, political, and military ties with the Palestinian Hamas and Palestinian movement, PLO, Hamas as well, because Palestine is a state. It's an occupied state, but it's a state under international law. So I think there's a trend among Muslim states to try to provide, not only economic, intellectual, moral support, but also I think military support and political support as well to, the Palestinian armed groups as well. And I think it's very significant, and it's going to change the balance. You see, nothing can, provide more support for the Palestinian cause than the success of the Palestinians. And I think the Hamas records to Israel, the last conflict, has shown, that to the world that actually the Palestinians could do it. Could do it. And this trust in the Palestinians, I think, will initiate some major policy changes among a lot of Muslim states, perhaps including some Arab states as well. The second question, Turkey is a major partner of Israel. I mean, a trading partner. I think people may be, perplexed by the fact that although this AK Party and Tayyip Erdogan, the major supporter of the Palestinians and the Turkish people are, full-heartedly in favor of the Palestinian struggle. But this, we should not forget that Turkey is a democracy. And there are elections in Turkey. I mean, AK Party may be removed from power after 3 years. So what happened is that AK Party actually inherited this complex relationship between Turkey and Israel. It's not only about economics; it was also about security cooperation, international agreements, intelligence cooperation. And the Turkey's often timid attitude towards the Palestinian cause, supporting Palestinians. And before the AK Party, before Tayyip Erdogan, before 2002. Turkey's support for the Palestinians was, of course, there, but it wasn't visible. It wasn't effective. It wasn't something that the Palestinians could feel. But now they feel it. So I think the issue that Turkey is a democracy, and there are lots of people in Turkey who have pragmatic attitude. I mean, it has been internalized. This pragmatism. We are a democracy. And we have to economically, engage the Israelis. And the business people in Turkey, they are not weak. I mean, they have some impact on policy. So there is this idea of Turkey acting as a bridge between Palestinians and Israelis. Although on the one hand, many Turkish people, they don't want any relations with Israel. They don't want to do anything with the Zionist state. But don't forget, we are a democracy, more or less democracy, although we have some weaknesses. And there are elections. And many people in Turkey, they think that we have to continue relations with Israel economically because we benefit from that. So it's very difficult for a democratic government really to take a radical attitude towards, possibly it may not be elected. Because this pragmatism is something that is being internalized by many people in Turkey through education, through the media, politics, foreign policy, Turkey's NATO connections, European Union. Don't forget, Turkey is actually negotiating for membership of the European Union. And the European Union would not want Turkey to establish take any radical action against Israel. And they are already very, very angry about Turkey because Turkey is full-heartedly supporting Israel, Palestinians, and condemning the Israeli crimes against humanity and war crimes. And so I think it's not a matter only for the existing government or Tayyip Erdogan himself, but it's a matter of understanding the political and historical as well as economic context of Turkey. It's a very difficult thing. Very difficult. What we do as people, is we don't use Israeli products. People are circulating messages. That's the only thing we can do at this stage. But hopefully, inshallah, inshallah, that's what we hope. Inshallah, in the future, Turkey may be able to change course in terms of economic relations. The third question about engaging normalization. I think it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Because Israel has not done anything really substantial in the context of granting rights to the Palestinians to deserve to be normalized, to normalize relations with Arab states. I think it's a disaster. I think it's an indication that many of the major states in the Arab world, including most of the Gulf states, Morocco, Sudan, and some others, it indicates actually that they do not trust their people. I think they lack legitimacy inside. And they put their full trust to the United States and the Israeli support. I think it indicates, in a way, how the people in the Muslim world, they have come to be politically aware and they demand change, basically. And the Arab Spring was an indication of this, longing for change, radical change, for dignity, for freedom, for social justice. So I think these regimes, they think that they cannot remain in power without American or Israeli support. And, this is not going to advance the cause of the Palestinians, of course. This is a defeat, this is defeatism, basically. But I think it's going to increase the impulse for change in the Arab world. Because this is seen basically as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. At least during the Cold War, they pretended to support the Palestinians. And they didn't have, coordinated relations, at least visibly. They didn't have coordinated relations with the Zionist state. But now they are doing it in the open. I think the change for better, for freedom and democracy and social justice in the Arab world has never been so strong. And I think it's going to occur at some stage in the near future. That's what I'm expecting.
Thank you, Professor Berger.
And so finally, I should say that In the case of South Africa, apartheid, for instance, the frontline states did not normalize relations with the apartheid South Africa until the system began to change. But this is completely opposite in the case of the Arab, neighboring Arab states. I think, it's a defeatism. In the short term, Israel seems to be holding the upper hand, but I think in the long term, medium and long term, it has irritated the Muslim world and the Arab world to such an extent that the men on the street, they want radical change now.
Thank you so much, Professor Birdal. Moving over to Naeem, we have a few questions to you as well, and I think there's a short video that will be coming up too. What should the central objective of a global solidarity movement, political, such as one state, two-state, dismantling Zionism in Palestine, or more of a human rights approach with equal rights, justice, etc.? Even if you think both, which would you emphasize and why? The second question is, can you suggest 3 practical steps to make a solidarity movement strong and sustained instead of ebbs and flows? How can we have a truly global solidarity movement that would be similar to the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa of the 80s? And the last question to Naeem is, what tactics could people use to compel their governments to resist American pressure and vocally support Palestinian rights?
Thank you, Dr. Sami, and the technical team for showing the video, though I couldn't. So that video was relating to my point about apartheid divides, Palestine unites. Let me get quickly to the questions. Zinat, really quite serious questions that you have. Central objective of global solidarity movement, one state versus two state, or should it be human rights? Look, I don't want to divide this kind of issue up into political versus human rights. I'm not going to talk about whether it should be one state or two state. That depends on what Palestinians ask us to support. But in terms of this kind of division between political and human rights, I don't think that there should be a division. The quotes I gave from Samora Machel, I think, explain what solidarity should mean, and it's solidarity is an act of love and support of people that are oppressed in whatever way they want, and they might want that love and support to be expressed. 3 practical steps for sustained global solidarity movement. Once again, I mean, this really requires a lot of talking, and we don't have a lot of time to do that. But again, I think that I highlighted some of the important points. I'm not going to repeat those, and not particularly because of time, Zinat, I'm not going to go into that. Tactics for people to compel the governments. This, of course, differs from state to state. Look, in most of the Arab states, tactics to compel their governments to support the Palestinian struggle is an extremely difficult thing to do, because in many of these states, people are not even allowed the freedom of association or movement, etc. In other countries, it would be different. In some African countries, for example, it might be easier or more difficult to influence their government. In the South African case, for example, it's taken lots of lobbying and lots of work with the government that has always claimed to be pro-Palestinian to get, for example, to the point where now the South African government is going to sign and ratify the Convention on Apartheid, and is going to push for the reactivation of the Special Committee on Apartheid. So, these tactics would differ from state to state, depending on the kind of state it is, and depending on the state's use of its repressive machinery against citizens and against dissent, etc. That's it.
Thank you so much, Naeem. We have a very short time before the next panel has to begin, and that will be the final one, which I am so excited about. So I'm going to be giving our panelists 30 seconds each to do their final statements and closing comments before I hand over to Yasmin, who will tell us more about the very exciting panel that's coming up after hours. Nardine, if we can hear your closing remarks.
Yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate everyone's talk, especially about escalating beyond solidarity, escalating our resistance in support of Palestinian liberation, because emails to Congress, appeals to empires, and even petitions are not enough or an adequate response to the genocide that we're witnessing in Palestine. We have to flood the streets and unconditionally support all forms of Palestinian resistance. Israel at its core cannot be salvaged. It can never comply with human rights or be separate from its apartheid system. Resistance is the only way. And as Palestinians are being slaughtered, we have to escalate. This looks like creating the understanding that we will continue to protest. We will continue to elevate the Palestinian struggle as long as Israel exists. And the liberation of Palestine necessitates the abolition of Israel. I want to end with a Malcolm X quote: "We need a paradigm shift. We need allies who are going to help us achieve a victory, not allies who are going to tell us to be nonviolent." That's Malcolm X. And just want to say victory will only be achieved through the masses. And we need international solidarity that unequivocally stands with the Palestinian people and their right to resist.
Thank you so much, Nardine. Miko, 30 seconds, your closing remarks, please.
Well, thank you again. Thanks for holding this conference, and thank you, Dr. Sami, for inviting me, and thank you all of you for participating and working so hard. I have to second what Nardine said. I think she hit it right on hit the nail right on the head. That's exactly what it's about. I think we have to escalate, not like what politicians in America are saying, tone down the rhetoric. We need to tone up the rhetoric. We need to make sure we do everything we can so that no more Palestinian children are hurt, no more Palestinian children are killed. The Palestinians can be free, the Palestinian activists can be safe. We need to do everything we can because it's up to us. There's no one else protecting Palestine. There's no one else protecting Palestinians. There's no one else that really cares. So it's all up to us, and we need to up the rhetoric and up the ante and really escalate so that we really can protect Palestine. And make it absolutely clear that there should be zero tolerance to Zionism, zero tolerance to the state of Israel, only a free, completely free, decolonized Palestine with the right of return. No compromises on these issues can possibly or should possibly be considered. And I think if we have the kind of voices that we've heard here and the kind of enthusiasm that I believe is out there, then I think next time we all meet, there will be a free Palestine, a free Jerusalem, and a free Al-Aqsa. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Professor Berdal, your closing remarks, please.
I think, Palestine, I think the freedom of Palestine, the liberation of Palestine is something connected to the liberation of, I think, the Muslim world and the Arab world as well. Actually, the liberation of the South, the global South, I think, is very much linked to the Palestinian struggle as well. I think the more the global South manages to establish sound support for the Palestinians and further their cause, I think the more they will be liberated from, the interventions, colonial interventions, neo-colonial interventions, imperialism, and the plunder of their economic resources and imperialistic aggression. I think Palestine is very much the epitome of the justice, the struggle for justice in the world. Anyone can identify with the Palestinian cause. And I present that in this post-Cold War era, in this 21st century, I think liberation of Palestine should be the universal ideology of humanity. I think we have to, identify with this cause because it's about our humanity. We cannot be free unless Palestine is liberated, because the Palestinian dilemma, the Palestinian, suffering, actually contains all sorts of suffering we have witnessed in the past. Colonialism, racism, aggression, settlers displacing, people, human rights violations, state terrorism, crimes against humanity, war crimes, you name it. I mean, and every day they are being insulted, and they are, and their culture is being denied. There is this Orientalism, racism, and also aggression against the Palestinians, almost denying their existence. So I think this is a cause that all of us can identify. And hopefully, if Palestine is liberated, and if we should be part of this liberation, I think the global South will have a greater leverage towards the hegemonic world system, and we may be able to establish a more just and peaceful international system.
Inshallah. Naeem, your 30 seconds closing remarks.
Zinat, I went over my time in my speech, so I'm just going to endorse what Professor Berdal, Miko, and Nerdine said and pass.
Thank you so much. I want to express my deep thanks to Professor Sami Al-Arian and the entire team at CIGA, to Yasmin, and to our fantastic panelists for expressing such forward-thinking views. And I think that this has been an excellent panel for us to reflect on and to build that solidarity that we so desperately need. We want to have that liberation and the revolution globally, inshallah. I'm going to be handing over to Yasmin to tell us about the next panel. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.
Very good, Zina. Thank you so much for leading a very inspiring panel discussion. I was really amazed by what our speakers had to say. So thank you for engaging everyone. And so coming up, we'll for our second international conference on Palestine, we will be having our last session in this conference starting in about 10 minutes. And it is going to be a very interesting topic. We live in the digital age, and so obviously we need to look at the role of film and the arts. So please join us at 10 p.m. Istanbul time, GMT +3, for a very engaging discussion that I look forward to. And on that note, I wish